Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 28th of September. Today I want to talk about Russian logistics and specifically rail lines. So in a separate video, I will talk about the frontline updates. But today I want to look at the fact that Russia is currently constructing a new rail line that will connect together several major cities along the Sea of Azov. This includes Rostov-on-Don, Taganrog, Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol. And together it will be around 250 kilometers of new rail line. And we already have satellite imagery that backs up that Russia has already started building up these new rail lines. And so, first of all, on my map in yellow, these are the current rail lines that have already been constructed years ago. In light green, if you zoom in, you'll see these are the rail lines that Russia is currently constructing as a part of their new operation. And you can see that the new line, it starts in Burny and it ends in Malovodny. So in total, the section is supposed to be around 60 kilometers of new rail line, and a large chunk has already been constructed. In addition, there was a bridge that the Russians are now actually beginning to build up. I don't think they're finished with it yet. And this is across the Kalmius River. So it's currently under construction. So the Russians do still need to fill up the gaps, but once they do, they will have this shortcut that will cut down the amount of time, and really the distance from the front line will be extended with the rail line that starts in Taganrog and ends in Mariupol. So let me elaborate. At the moment, if you want to go from Rostov to Mariupol, then you need to first go to Taganrog, and then from there you have to make this huge loop going all like this, all around Donetsk Oblast, and actually enter the city of Donetsk itself, which, remember, that's very close to the front line. And a lot of heavy fighting is going on in that region. Ukrainians are shelling this region heavily. They have large batteries of M777s, for instance, in the city of Kharkov, which is pretty close to Donetsk Oblast. And if we are to zoom in for a second, you'll see that this section of the rail line that is drawn in yellow, that I'm going over in red, from Olenivka to Stepne, this is so close to the front line. It's only like 6 kilometers away. Now, I'm not saying that Ukraine is going to shell from the front line, obviously, but as I said before, they do have batteries in Kharkov, so they could reach the rail line. They could send sabotage groups, perhaps, to try to create issues there, laying bombs. And there's also the threat, I'm not saying it will happen, but there's a threat that Ukraine will be able to attack in that direction and actually physically take over this part of the rail line, given how close it is to the front line. So now, that's why the Russians are trying to construct this new route that will, first of all, diversify the routes that they currently have in order to prevent a logistical crisis, where if a certain part of the old rail line is targeted by Ukraine, they would have no means of basically using a rail as transport to reach Mariupol, for instance. But also compare basically the lengths between the two of them. Look how long it would take to reach Mariupol using the current routes, and then compare it to the one using the light green route. You save about 60 kilometers if you're like starting here and branch out. You'll see that the distances to reach Mariupol are about 150, 160 kilometers. And then if you're using the new route, which is still under construction, it would take you about 100 kilometers. So yeah, you're saving about 50 kilometers, and this is in only this one specific area. And this is a part of Russia's broader plan of building up the rail line that will start off with these light green lines that are currently being constructed, make its way to Mariupol, and then from there they will build a new section of the rail line that will connect Mariupol to Berdyansk directly. So then you don't have to make this massive loop around the entire center of Russian-controlled Zaporozhye to make it from Mariupol to Berdyansk via rail. This will, first of all, save a lot of time for Russia's rail, and also it will mean that the Russians will have a route that is not as close to the front line. Now, the current rail line isn't that close to the front line. Like, you can't have shorter range artillery targeting it because, like, let's measure the distances. It's about 40 kilometers away, and the Ukrainian artillery is probably like 60 kilometers away, 70 kilometers away. But for instance, HIMARS could fire that far, and let's say they're using a Storm Shadow or something like that, it would be able to hit that far. But to be fair, if the Ukrainians were using a Storm Shadow missile, also the route from Mariupol to Berdyansk would be within the Storm Shadow range. Now, if we're looking even further to the west, you'll also see that it's a part of Russia's plan to connect the city of Berdyansk to Melitopol. This is very important, and I'll get into two reasons why it's important. First of all, it will decrease the amount of time that it takes to reach the two cities, because again, you have this huge loop that you have to make in order to go from Berdyansk to Melitopol, and in the process, you have to stop in Tokmak. Tokmak is a city that's currently relied upon heavily by the Russians as a logistics point, as a rail hub, rail lines running through it. And it's about 20 to 25 kilometers away from the front line. So, sure, that's not within the range of shorter range artillery. But again, there are certain calibers of munitions from self propelled howitzers or from MLRS systems that could reach that far. So, there is always that threat. And so by creating this new line, you decrease the volume of the Ukrainian attacks that could potentially occur on the logistics, and you also diversify. Now, if we zoom out, this also means that if the the Russians are able to construct this new line, that the Russians will not have to rely as much on the logistics in Crimea. If you look at the current rail logistics in Crimea, if you want to move anything from Krasnodar, for instance, across into the Crimean Peninsula, you need to do it through the Kerch rail bridge. And of course, not all of Russia's supplies are being moved in via rail. As I said before, there's highways that go across the Kerch Bridge as well. You have ships that are transporting heavy equipment as well. So I don't want to make people to think that it's only rail, but in regards to rail specifically, once you reach Crimea, there's really only two rail lines that branch out into what was previously Ukrainian controlled territory, now is Russian controlled territory in Kherson. One of the rail lines branches out in the direction of Western Kherson, in the direction of Dnieper River. So that would be the Kherson front. And sure, if you zoom out, you'll see that technically, if you use this route, you can make a full loop and then make your way towards Zaporozhye. But Russia can't do this because they don't control the section of the rail line that makes the loop. That's under Ukrainian control. So there's really an earnest one rail line that the Russians are relying on from Crimea into key cities like Melitopol, Tokmak, Vasilivka further north as well, to unload their heavy equipment via rail. And that is this one route over here from Jankoy, this city over here. And you have to go across this bridge, this rail bridge, which has previously been targeted by Ukrainian forces using Storm Shadow missiles. Russia's still currently using it, but again, there is that threat. It's a very tenuous grip on the logistics over here, because at any moment, if the Ukrainians were to be successful, this would take out one of the main routes that the Russians are currently using to supply this western part of Zaporozhye Oblast. Of course, they could use the current routes from Russia proper into Donetsk Oblast and then into Zaporozhye Oblast. But as I said before, the amount of time that it takes is pretty long, and the ranges of the rail line from the front line are pretty close. And this is, again, why the Russians are trying to build up this new rail line over here, why they do think that it will be able to diversify their resources and prevent Ukrainians from hampering their ability to send in large volumes of equipment at a fast rate to the front line. Now let's look at the ranges of Ukrainian weapons that they currently have at their disposal and whether they would actually be able to make a dent in current and future Russian logistical plans. So now I'm using Deep State Map, and they have this really cool feature that you could basically click on any Ukrainian weapon system they have to see the range and the radius. So I just put this M142 HIMARS in Kharkov, and you can see the radius. It would be able to affect the city of Volnovakha, for instance, which is currently under Russian control, and as I said before, is one of their key rail junctions, which connects between Donetsk and Volnovakha. It would be able to reach Polohi, I believe, or actually it cannot reach Polohi from this region, but if you were to move it a bit to the east, for instance, it would easily reach Polohi, which is another rail hub. It would reach Tokmak as well. It would not actually be able to reach Melitopol unless you move it a bit closer to the front line, which I don't know if Ukraine is doing that. I don't know exactly the distances between the front line that Ukraine is firing the HIMARS, but again, it is pretty close to the border between it being out of range entirely. Now, if we look at Mariupol, for instance, no matter what, unless you move it right next to the front line, then it cannot hit Mariupol. And same thing goes with Berdyansk. It will not be able to reach Berdyansk. and it would not be able to reach like Taganrog, for instance, or Rostov-on-Don, any of these other key cities that I just mentioned that are adjacent to the Sea of Azov. Now, if we're looking at the Storm Shadow or Scalp EG cruise missile, which the Ukrainians were given by the British and the French respectively, this has a range, a maximum effective firing range of 250 kilometers. And so this would, no matter what, be able to hit this new rail line, would be able to hit the logistical hub in Mariupol that the Russians are currently building up. Because as I said before, the Russians are trying to move away their logistical hub and their majority of the resources away from Crimea in favor of Mariupol, just because of how close it is to Russia proper, and you don't have to deal with a bridge connecting between the two of them. Also, it'll be able to hit Melitopol, Berdyansk, basically all of those major cities that I mentioned before, and whatever rail line will be connecting them. The obvious issue, though, is how many of these does Ukraine really have? Because we've already seen Ukraine utilize these Storm Shadow missiles in previous strikes on logistical and just military targets in Crimea itself. And we don't know how many they have left at the moment. They may not have enough to really create a serious issue for any new Russian logistical situation in terms of rail lines, especially now as Russia is trying to diversify them. So then we have to think about what other systems the Ukrainians are going to be receiving. There was a lot of talk about, for instance, the Ukrainians receiving the Taurus missiles from the Germans, which has a firing range of 500 kilometers. So that would be able to reach deep into Crimea and would also be able to reach into Russian-controlled territory. Not even speaking about the new rail line that I spoke about a second ago. But we don't know if Germany is actually going to be sending them, because I just read this article saying that Olaf Scholz, he was hesitant to actually agree and give the green light for the shipment of the Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians out of fear of whatever retaliation would come from the Russian side. That's what the Western press is saying. And then we also have the ATACMS. And the ATACMS, in regards to those ballistic missiles, they have an effective firing range that really does vary depending on the variant. Some have about 140 kilometers, others have 300 kilometers. We don't know which one is going to be given by the United States to Ukraine, but there are reports that America definitely will give it to them. We're going to have to wait and see when and if that happens. And then if those ATACMS would be given, then regardless, they would be able to hit any sort of part of the new Russian rail line that is being constructed. But depending on the firing range, it would or would not be able to hit deeper into Crimea, for instance, or deeper into Russian neighboring oblasts like Rostov or southern more like Krasnodar, for instance. And just to speak about the amount that's going to be given to Ukraine, we don't know that as well, but it's probably going to be a fairly small amount. Even if the Germans were to agree to give Tauruses and if the Americans give the ATACMS, when you add it all together, it would still probably be a small amount based off of what we've been seeing over the past couple of months with these weapons shipments from the West. And even Budanov, who's Ukraine's military intelligence chief, he admitted that Ukraine would need at least hundreds of ATACMS in order to make a serious change to the situation on the ground. So really, even if they're given this, then it may not be enough to create a serious issue for the Russian logistics. And so that's really it for today. We're going to have to wait and see if Russia is able to successfully complete the construction of this rail line. I've seen reports that are estimating that it will be completed by the end of the year. So we're going to have to wait and see for that. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.